Let's talk about Dune Messiah by Frank Herbert. I've got it in this great Dune trilogy copy, so it is somewhere in the middle there. This is the second book in the Dune series, the first in what is considered the original trilogy. Frank Herbert wrote 6 books, and then his son and Kevin J. Anderson have written a lot more since. And so this is sometimes considered an epilogue to Dune. You know, really this is just the last bit of the original novel. And some people were like, oh, you have to read Messiah to understand Dune or whatever. I'd see it more as a coda to and reflection upon Dune. That is to say, it is its own beast. It really is its own beast, very different to Dune. But it's short. It's under 200 pages in most editions. This it's 160, and it really it serves to bookend and reflect upon Dune. It doesn't move the world onto wholly different stories. You know what I mean, as in it's doing a very specific thing to do with the original novel Dune as well as its own thing. It's symbiotic, I guess. So the total non-spoiler book review that doesn't spoil anything from Dune or Dune Messiah. It's not as genuinely visionary and vast as Dune, the original novel. It's a genuine 5-star, the original novel, one of the best ever. It's the better book by a small margin, I would say. And that shows the praise I'm going to offer Messiah, that I think it is. This is very good, basically. And it's much more intimate. It plays notes and engages with ideas that Dune doesn't. Absolutely read it if you like Dune. I don't think anyone who read Dune will be like, oh no, Messiah was terrible, it was a massive step down. I know some people will say most people would say I think it's not as good, but I think it really is very good. Now, the rest of this will be non-spoiler for Dune Messiah, but I'm going to be implicitly spoiling Dune throughout. So leave now if you have not read Dune. So 12 years after the Battle of Arrakeen, Paul is the Emperor. He is married to Princess Irulan, but they don't have any intimacy. He has Chani as his concubine, kind of pseudo-wife. His sister Alia is the prophetess, high priestess of the religion that is emerging around Paul, spanning this galaxy-spanning religion that's growing up due to the jihad that is conquering the universe in Paul's name. Now, the biggest theme, I think, here is about necessity, about do things have to happen? What has to happen? How do you deal with the onrush of events? Loads of people in this have, and one thing that really plays into that is loads of people in this have prescience, foresight into the future, which means they can see the options, they can see what might happen, they can see the most likely paths, what will happen if they try to avoid the most likely paths, which of course sometimes you're like, oh wow, I don't want that path, but the other path is even worse. Paul has it. Alia has it even more so in some ways. She was exposed in the womb basically to a foresight drug, a massive overdose. Her mother took a massive overdose of a foresight drug, if you remember that from the original one, the unchanged spice melange. The plotters against Paul, because there are plotters against Paul here, so a couple of them have it too. So the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Moem has it, the Bene Gesserit leader, and the Guild Navigator Edric. And because Guild Navigators are creatures of spice, essentially, that actually shields the conspiracy from Paul's view. So it creates it's an echo of the mule in Second Foundation, or is it in one of the other Foundation novels? But it echoes the mule, the idea that there is a wild card that can't fully be accounted for, but here via a parallel to Paul's powers. So you have these plotters, as I mentioned. They're at the very start. This is the first chapter. They are trying to map routes into the future, work out how they can deal with Paul. The plotters are Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Moem, Edric from the Guild, Scytale from the Bene Tleilaxu, who are flesh crafters, scientists, genetic engineers, and they're introduced here and are really interesting. And finally, Princess Irulan, who is a bit irresolute and unsure, but because and we'll talk about this, because she's hurt by Paul and neglected and feels like she's failed at what she's been made for, she wonders whether she should take part in whatever this very, sometimes quite confusing plot against Paul is. And they are trying to map routes into the future to deal with Paul, right? According to their own specific aims, because different factions within the plot have different aims. And then you've got Paul and Alia trying to map routes into the future for the good of their family. And Paul specifically always feels overwhelmed, as he did in Dune, by the inevitable, inescapable jihad, which has already claimed billions of lives. Paul has no doubts about the fact that in some ways he's a monster due to what, but then he is the lesser monster perhaps, because he can see what might happen one way or the other. He is trapped by his status as Messiah. As Muad'Dib, he is the Messiah of the Jihad, and there's a religion led by this body called the Kizarate rising around him, which, as I say, Alia is connected to too. He's trapped by the way that necessity rules his life. It rules the life of his beloved Chani, he is heartbroken by the way that they seem to be unable to have a child. But he's not angry at her for that. She, on the other hand, is very practical and pragmatic, and that creates tension and heartbreak. But this is there's this interweaving of this high theme of necessity, and you can only tell this from the examples of necessity, with characters and with love stories that is really top tier, and not something. I mean, in terms of the melding of high concept and slice of life almost is quite rare and really well done here. It isn't just a philosophical reflection, and in the first book, in Dune, if there is a critique, sometimes it can feel like there is a distance, and maybe it's praise as well, as it is a device Herbert uses intentionally. There is a distance between the reader and the characters, which can sometimes make, because he's kind of showing this world in which people work the same as us but differently in this very strange situation. Whereas here there is the stakes are much more regularly intimate and ones that we might recognise. Paul's terrified of what he has become, what he is becoming. He's heartbroken. He and Chani can't have a child. He doesn't blame Chani. She's more pragmatic. She is heartbroken as well, of course. He misses the old simplicities of the desert, and for all his, he's driven on by events. He can't change that, he feels. For all his Bene Gesserit training, he can't really control himself either. So, for instance, his relationship with Irulan, I've said Irulan feels neglected. Paul is sort of alternately resenting, mistreating, pitying, trying to have mercy on Irulan, because Irulan is a necessity in a different way. She's legitimacy. She's the last emperor's daughter, but the whole deal was that Paul would do that and kind of and spare her father and keep some kind of order according to what the great houses would expect. But on the other hand, he would not actually really be her husband. And that's something where, for all his Bene Gesserit training, for all his vision of the future, he can't control his own behaviour. Alia, maybe even more so. Alia is a 16-year-old reaching adulthood. Big theme here is actually having a sexual awakening, but she's also, she contains the wisdom and knowledge of all her female ancestors before her, pretty much, and the whole racial wisdom accumulated by the Bene Gesserit, caught up with her precognitive abilities. This all due to her strange origin, and that's a weird thing where you have both. She's young and ancient, and she falls in love with another strange figure. And this is one of the. It's not really a twist in the sense it comes up early, so this is not a significant spoiler. Basically, the Bene Tleilaxu provide something called a Gola, a clone of the dead Duncan Idaho, who died saving Paul, his mother, Lady Jessica, and therefore the tiny Alia as well in the womb. And we know that in this thing and this again is raised in the first chapter by the plotters, they're going to provide this Gola who will in some way bring about Paul's downfall, they think, and they're going to use his friend to do that, because this will create all sorts of tensions and spur on different events and so on. And Alia meets this clone called Hate, and he doesn't know who he is except secondhand. He's told who he is, but he increasingly has disquieting senses of who he was beyond what he's been told. Is he just the genetic pattern of Duncan Idaho, who is therefore told, oh, you are like Duncan Idaho genetically, or is he in some sense really Duncan, the great hero who saved the Atreides, who sacrificed his life for the Atreides? And what's the difference between those two? And must he do what he's been designed to do? Can he in any way escape his programming? Is he ruled by necessity as well? and that is who Alia falls in love with, which is just a really interesting, sweet, weirdly sweet at points, very offbeat compared to, it's not at all what Paul and Chani are like in the first book in terms of how it's presented. It is a love story, and it's really interesting and quite affecting one. So this is a really different book to Dune, I would say. It's stylistically and tonally different for all the similarities in descriptive style, very similar. The hyper-awareness of micro-behaviours, the weird kind of language, some of that is actually escalated here, so that is the same, but here living and vibrant characters struggle to shake off the dead hand of destiny, and in a way that is often much more immediate than in Dune. So there's less concern thematically with ecology, more concern with the way power and history works, I guess, the inevitability of violence, the corruption or perhaps transmutation of political passion or religious passion into, negatively, structure and bureaucracy. But maybe that's what has to happen for them to work and to be a useful part of society. Interesting, there's also no Lady Jessica in this book. It's a really interesting choice. She goes back to Caladan, the Atreides' homeworld, the water world, and we hear from her secondhand. I think we hear one or two letters from her or something, or bits of letters, but we don't hear from her, we don't see her. And that's an interesting choice because a major point of view, who is the previous generation's insight into what's happening, is removed from the board in terms of our own point of view. And one last comment on character here, which shows the kind of the subtlety and change in how things are presented. Instead of Jessica, we have Irulan. Irulan does not serve the same purpose or function structurally, but there's a way in which you can see that part of the emotional centre of the book, which was Jessica, does not transfer to Chani so much, even though Chani has more point of view moments than Irulan. Irulan I think has one brief point of view, but transfers in a subtle way onto Irulan, I think, in lots of ways. She is the daughter of the last Padishah emperor. She is a mark of legitimacy for the new regime, but she's also a neglected wife who has never had conjugal relations with Paul. She's treated with distrust by those around her. She was, we hear very early on, pretty much, she was basically a wonderful tool for a task which is now gone or beyond her, which is either failed at or which has failed to be or exist. And I think, as I say, one very brief point of view from her, but this is otherwise observed. This is from the outside. There's an intentional porcelain doll presentation of her, which I think is really interesting. She's not sympathetic per se. She may or may not, there are bits where you might sympathise and where you wouldn't, but it's not like you think, man, she's just such a nice, warm person. I wish I could have a beer with her. But we come to understand her to be perhaps even a greater victim of circumstance, of history, of racial destiny than Paul himself. And that is such an interesting perspective to offer, and not what you'd expect from having read Dune. You wouldn't expect it to suddenly be these fairly deep set of reflections on love, marriage, as well as the high-level themes. It's a really good book. I definitely recommend it on the basis you read Dune and liked it. I've filmed a video with my friend Abby from Naked History. I'll link her channel in the description. I don't know when bits of this will come out. She'll be using some of it for a video she's making. I may put the whole thing up on my channel. But yeah, we do a full spoiler discussion of the two books in terms of themes, subtext, things like that, and some of the artistic things or skills that Herbert uses to do things. So yeah, wait for that, check that out, and check Abby's channel out. Tell me what you think of Dune Messiah in the comments. I guess generally just say what your thoughts on the later Dune books after Dune are, because it'd be interesting to get some views on that. Till next time.